Yes, and welcome once again, everyone. Thank you for joining us. People will be joining throughout. I am Rena Goldenberg-Lynch, and this is Inga. As you know, we are faces that you will see today, as we've asked everybody else to stay off camera. I want to tell you a little bit about the Big Fish Academy, what Inga and I have created, our backgrounds as well, and then we'll tell you a little bit about the format of this meeting, of this expert interview, the first of many this year, and we hope that you will join us in future ones as well. And Inga will also then go through the technical infrastructure of how this will work, and then we'll get started on the content. So I hope that's all great with you. So who are we? Who am I? Like I said, Rena Goldenberg-Lynch. I run a company called At the Table, which is a gender diversity and inclusion consultancy. And Inga, as you know, also has a consultancy called W2O Consulting. And we've known each other for quite a while. And a while ago, we started talking. We worked on a project together, and we started talking, and we realized that there was a gap in the market for diversity and inclusion training and advice for those who are involved in it on a daily or part-time basis in their companies. So that's who we call practitioners, so people who are really interested in embedding diversity and inclusion in their organization. There isn't, and as yet as we know, there isn't one place where you can go to get all your resources, to get your information, to get some advice, and to get perhaps some ideas and insight. So that's what the Big Fish Academy is all about. And as we said, we launched it recently, but that's bringing together 15 years of experience between Inga and myself in diversity and inclusion. So we're kicking off this program today with expert interviews, all of which will accommodate speakers and experts on different topics. We're kicking off with a roundup of diversity and inclusion trends. What has been happening in the past? What have we seen start to evolve last year? And what we are going to predict are the trends and developments for this year going forward. The format of this session, the expert interview session, is more like a meeting rather than a webinar, in that Inga and I, and later Inga, somebody else, or myself and somebody else, we'll have a conversation about these topics. It's a casual conversation where we share our expertise, like a podcast, but live over camera. And we invite you to participate as well. Now, obviously, we had a great response to this very first session. We had 60 people register. We have 24 people online, which is great. And so we think that having the camera on is probably going to be a little bit difficult. So we ask you and invite you to share your ideas and questions and insights, and we will ask you for them throughout in the chat box. So please feel free to put your thoughts and ideas in there. You can also raise your hand if you click on the participants box. Is that the right box, Inga?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and you find the participant box if you move your mouse off the screen or your finger, whatever you're using, and then there's actually a bar comes up and you see the word participants. You click that and then you can raise your hands and we can see that. Or you can say yes or no to questions we ask.
And how do we turn you off? If you've raised your hands like that. Yes. Okay, great. So why don't we get started, Inga? Is there anything else you wanted to add to the format before we get going?
No, I think everyone's there. Probably for ease of watching, you may want to choose the speaker view, which is in the top right-hand corner. So instead of seeing all the squares, but you may actually prefer that. But if you want to see us bigger, you can choose the speaker view. And obviously you are all on mute, so you can't say anything apart from in the chat. So please do, if you're phoning in, you can't use that. But if you're on your PC or on your phone, please do use the chat where you can. Same thing, you move your mouse to the bottom of the screen and then you click chat and you can join in the chat. And I can see some people are already saying hello to each other in the chat, which is fabulous.
Wonderful. One last thing is, we've said that before, but we are recording the session. We will be emailing it to everyone who's on the call today, as well as registered but couldn't attend. So just bear that in mind when you put any information into the chat box. Hopefully that's not going to be a deterrent at all. Okay, Inga, over to you. Let's
topic for today. What is happening? What are the latest trends in diversity and inclusion? What is happening? We'll start with actually looking back, putting it a bit in context. Where have we come from over the last sort of 20 years in diversity and inclusion? And then we look at where were we last year in 2019, after which we go to where do we think we're heading in 2020? And obviously, especially when we're talking about what have we learned in 2019, what was new on the block, we'd love to invite your views as well in the chat. What have you seen? What have you learned? Because this is very much a session where we're also learning from each other. And when we're talking about 2020, what do you expect coming up? I'd love to hear what all of you are thinking there as well. But where have we come from? Well, see, in my view, I think where it all started is with equal rights. So sort of, yeah, in the 60s and 70s, it was all about people creating equal rights. It was about legislation, and organizations responded to that. So they had equal policies, equal pay policies came in, policies where men and women were moved at the same level, and there was a lot about equality policies in organizations. That moved on though, because actually we realized it wasn't just about giving everyone equal rights and equal education, because that wasn't the way, and it was a lot about women those days, that women were actually moving to the top of organizations. So they were being educated, but they weren't being hired, or they were being hired, but they weren't moving up at the same rate as men. So then it became about empowering these people, empowering different target groups, women leadership courses, encouraging women to step up. It became about women's networks. And from that, we've moved on now, because we found actually that doesn't seem to work. It's not just about fixing the women, became a term that came in, I think, about 7 years ago. It's not just about fixing the women or fixing your employees. It's actually much more about fixing the organization, creating an environment that works for everyone. It became about valuing difference. So not just bringing in that diversity, but actually valuing the difference of everyone in your workforce. And that's where we are now. Anything to add there, Rina?
No, and I think you're absolutely right that it started also as something to looking specifically at women and how to empower them, give them tools, give them the confidence. Confidence is something that's been talked about and written about quite a lot. A lot of very prominent journalists and actors and speakers have been talking about this topic of confidence in women, and how we've all been sort of cast with a wide brush of not being confident enough. And to be fair, when I stepped into this field, that's also what I thought was the issue. But as you say, we've moved on from then quite a lot. It's no longer about fixing women. It's no longer about women not being confident. It's about looking at the system, looking at the organizational culture, and to see how we can actually tap into the diversity of every individual, including perhaps the one that speaks up less frequently and less vocally.
Yeah, and then a lot of target groups have been added, or what I call target groups, when it started really with women and gay rights was a big movement, but nowadays the area has really widened, because when you start talking about diversity and valuing diversity, and what came out for a lot of my clients actually, they got the feedback that women isn't a homogenous category really. Women is about women from ethnic minorities, women from different age groups, women with disabilities, and they all face different issues, women with different religions. And actually then people realize that it is much more about all these different areas of diversity. And it's not like these areas of diversity didn't exist before, but they all came together at some point and they started moving up in the agenda. And we've also seen that, and you may not recognize this in your industry, because we've actually seen that from where I sit, I've seen that go as a bit of a wave through different industries. So from where I sit, I saw it sort of starting to happen here in the UK in banking. banking sort of was like started with women's networks, I think following some of the US women's networks. And then law firms or professional services followed because, yeah, they saw some interesting client work coming up, but they needed to get their in-house systems in order before that they could offer those services. Then the law firms and the legal profession started following, and it got higher up the agenda. And more recently, I think we've got construction, engineering, and tech joining in. And I'm forgetting here the government, of course. The government has been throughout also leading in this, and they may well have started at the same time as the banks. And now with the tech sector moving on, what I'm noticing is really interesting that it seems like they're almost ahead of everyone else because it's become a really big issue for them. It really got in the public eye that organizations like Google and Facebook and Microsoft have barely any women working for them, and certainly not in senior positions. And that became a real topic for them, and they've put a lot of time and effort into this and are really pushing it up the agenda very fast.
Yeah. The other thing that has started, the evolution has moved on from looking at gender, as you said, and looking at some other type of minorities as well. And the conversation it has moved on from gender to balance, to gender balance, gender parity, not just women, but in the true sense of the word gender at men, women, and everything in between. So, and then also I think the focus on diversity has started moving, switching from diversity to inclusion. And diversity was always, how do we get more people of different backgrounds, from us starting with women, then maybe LGBT type background and ethnic minorities, and more and more and more. So the diversity field in itself has widened, and lots of other types of diversity are now being considered. But as we said, it was all about understanding how to change the culture, how to bring that diversity in-house and take to include it fully for the benefit of the organization. And that's where inclusion started becoming more central as a development force. So from women to balance, to gender balance, to inclusion in particular. Some organizations don't even reference diversity anymore. For instance, Deloitte. In Deloitte, they have respect and inclusion as the space, not diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
And we have heard also in America, Deloitte has done away with all the different employee networks because they consider themselves sufficiently inclusive that there's no need for the purpose that was served by those networks. So that is a trend that has been developing. And of course, inclusion has also moved on from inclusion to belonging. And I actually think that belonging is just the other side of the coin from inclusion. Inclusion is about trying to welcome everyone, trying to tap into everyone's diversity, getting them to bring their whole selves to work. Whereas inclusion is the other side, is how do I as an employee feel like a member of a family, a member of a team? How do I feel like I belong in this team? So it's just an extension of that term, but it describes it very, very well from the individual's perspective. So that has been the trend so far.
And do let us know, right? We're throwing all these trends at you here and they all interact together, but let us know if you recognize this, what you see, what we're leaving out perhaps. And one key thing I think that I'd like to add there, and I think that is my last bit on where have we come from, is that we have moved away where industries have realized, organizations have realized that they can't do it on their own. And it's really moved from within, something coming up from the bottom of the organization, grassroots, to something that's come onto the boardroom agenda, and from that to an industry issue. So what you see, so it was initially all about awards, then now it's a lot about benchmarking, how are we doing compared to others, and then it's become about sharing best practices. So we see a lot of industry associations producing best practice guides, best practice panels, best practice conferences, very much per industry, because each industry has its own issues, its own image that they're working on, so external image towards employees. So I think that's that's the real driver behind getting it up on the boardroom agenda, is then driving an industry-wide approach.
Mm-hmm. And I think we can probably focus on some of these themes a little bit deeper when we look at what's happened last year, and maybe we should start looking at that.
Yeah, go on, Rina. What happened? What have you learned
last year?
What was new on your agenda? What did clients say to you that you thought, oh, is this now suddenly coming up here?
Well, I have to say the dial is slowly shifting, and that's really what we have been trying to do, myself for about 6 years, and Inga even longer than that. And the conversation is moving on. So what has started happening quite more widely, I suppose, is that companies are starting to realize that diversity is not just the right thing to do. Diversity is integral to the success of business, and that's also what elevated the topic on the agenda onto the board agenda. There's a lot of talk about culture. There's a lot of talk about in corporate law in general around culture and the responsibilities of boards to create the right kind of culture, the right kind of engagement, and diversity and inclusion sits right within it. So it's no longer possible to ignore it. And I think the realization, the penny has dropped, and is continuing to drop. That's my sense. And that is also what I hear from my clients as well. They're taking it a lot more seriously, and they're looking at implementing solutions that are embedded and change the whole organization and not just on a project basis. Is that what you see as well, Inga?
Yeah, really, it's becoming much more of a business approach, whereas that grassroots ad hoc approach. And I mean, is sort of, we're moving away from that. And to be fair, I wouldn't be surprised if many of you are in organizations where this is not happening, where you're really just starting, and when you are maybe even one of those people in the grassroots, or trying to sort of coordinate whatever is happening on the grassroots level and trying to move it up the agenda in your organization. So when we talk about trends, these are things we see in our clients, and usually the fact that they're working with us, that they're investing in diversity and inclusion, already shows they are ahead of the pack. Many organizations are really just starting as well. And one of the things that is driving this, what I see at the moment, what really came up for me in 2019, which is a brand new word, and you may have heard it, but I'd never heard it before until this year, was the employee value proposition. So it's a lot harder to get the right talent. So not only do the organizations have to have a client value proposition, but now they also have to have a value proposition for employees. What do we offer to our employees? How can we differentiate? How can we differentiate ourselves from other companies? How can we, in that war for talent, how can we stand out? And there, diversity and inclusion is becoming bigger. And that goes with offering better flexible working policies, better parental leave policies, having nice benefits, such as support for women throughout pregnancy and when returning to work. It comes with return to work programs, but it also comes with mental health programs. How can we help people stay sane at work, looking at work-life balance? So there's a whole thing around that employee value proposition that is also driving diversity and inclusion up the agenda. And interestingly, you see that millennials and Generation Z actually really value diversity. So if you want to recruit employees and be competitive, you need to speak to that younger generation.
Yeah. And so as we are speaking throughout this session and bringing up these trends and ideas, it'd be great to hear from you whether any of this is familiar to you, whether this is something that resonates, you've seen it, you'd like to see it. And if you have questions, think of some questions for us, type them into the chat box as we speak, and we'll address them. Let's make this an interactive session. And so while you're thinking about that, the other thing to add to that that I've noticed as well with clients is there's a lot more readily available collaboration and knowledge sharing. So organizations see each other more as peers rather than competitors when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Some organizations even go as far as sharing and supporting their clients. So it's no longer, you know, hanging out your dirty laundry. That's not how it's seen anymore. It is really something that everybody is trying to embrace and learn from each other. We host sessions where we invite people, diversity champions from different organizations, similar to this, where we talk about a specific topic. And I love it how readily people contribute the initiatives, the ideas, the insights that work for them. And that is certainly a trend that is going to continue as we go forward.
Yeah. And what I've seen in 2019, we got our first client, Rena and I jointly together, who asked us to work on an onboarding program, where a client says to us, we have this amazing inclusive culture that we're very proud of, but we're hiring a lot of new people. How can we make sure they understand what is expected? How can we make sure that they help us keep up our standards? So we made a digital module for them about inclusive behaviors, which was really about helping. Of course, you can't change behaviors in a digital module, but it's a bit like the e-learning you get when you're onboarding on health and safety or on the GDPR legislation. It's just about knowing what is expected, knowing where the organization is. So that onboarding is a brand new trend that I've seen. Anything else you've seen in 2019, Rena?
Well, there are lots of new tools as well. One of the questions that's come up is, are there any trends on accountability measurement strategies?
Oh, yeah.
I think it's a very interesting question as well. When I first entered this space, so this is, like I said, going back 5-6 years ago, there was a lot of talk about targets, a lot of talk about KPIs, a lot of talk about objective setting for each of the team leaders. And that has actually ebbed away a little bit. Now, that's not to say that diversity measurements are not being maintained, but I think there has been another realization that you cannot force people into diversity and inclusion, that you have to lead by example, set by role modeling their behavior, and also by putting in place measures that work, that nudge each other from different perspectives and from different directions into certain types of behaviors. So yes, there's still measurements out there, understanding how engaged people are, how inclusive the culture is, and some of this is measured by asking people to self-declare sometimes the kind of perhaps criteria that aren't readily visible, like mental health or sexual orientation, and that is another measurement of your inclusion and how good an organization you are from an inclusion and belonging perspective. So that's not quite the question you asked, but that's my take on that. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Inga.
Yeah, definitely. I think some organizations are moving. I can see on the one hand, there's that real business approach, which does require measurement and KPIs, and it does require a mission and a link to the corporate strategy. At the same time, some organizations I've seen move away from measuring absolutely everything and rationalizing and saying, let's measure those few things that we're actually using and that are actually numbers that we help to shape our policy. Yeah. Then for 2020, I do see a lot of organizations now, because it's no longer about women or about LGBT, because it is about age and about mental health and about neurodiversity and about, intersex and transgender, and the agenda has widened so much that actually organizations want to measure all of those, and it becomes a lot about how can we get people to share our data, and there's a lot of organizations really moving very fast on that. I was just today reading of a large construction company. I think it was, no, I can't, let's not mention a name, because I'm not quite sure whether it was McDonald's, Skanska, or Sir Robert McAlpine, who managed to get their new hires up from, I think it was 20 or 30% sharing their diversity areas, up to 80 to 90%. So there are, the organizations are now really starting to to get more clever on getting people to share.
And those are the conversations that I have frequently with clients as well, is coming up with ways in which your employees, the staff, will share information more readily. So it's moving on from KPIs and accountability to almost data analytics, understanding your employees, understanding what their backgrounds are, how you can accommodate them better, how you can nurture better, and therefore get more out of them as a result, both in creativity, engagement, etc. So that is one of the trends that I've observed.
Great question here, Rina, coming in from Sarah.
Yeah.
She says, I think for real change to happen, as we were saying, and you were saying as well, it's about different behaviors. Often we see policies put in place, but the culture that sits around it isn't quite there yet. Do you have any examples of where leadership role modeling is working really well? And I mean, I'd like to start with one that I absolutely love, which is Vodafone. In Vodafone, they don't even have KPIs. They do have KPIs. They don't even have a business case for diversity. I know the leader, the CEO of Vodafone came in a number of years ago and said, we want this because we know it works. We don't need any more proof. We don't need any more measurement or business cases. We know it works. We need to just start doing it. And any senior leader or middle manager who said, well, is this the right thing to do? Do we not need to sort of have some more of a business case? He actually said, no, we know it. It's been proven countless times. We just need to implement it. So that was, I think, a key role modeling thing that he did. Another role modeling thing, yeah, I'm not sure if that's role modeling actually. Another thing he did to really drive it through the organization is starting to ask those questions in the right places. So when you're visiting one of the countries, it's a global organization, of course, asking, well, how is it possible that this country is so far behind these other countries? And then rewarding the countries that are running ahead. So they were having some key measurements that they were rewarding and that they were pulling out and saying, look, these countries are already getting it, and start learning from these countries. So he was really making it a conversation at that senior level, at country level. Any examples of role modeling that you have, Rina?
I was thinking that, maybe counterintuitively, some of the tech companies that you mentioned, Inga, and I'm going to throw Google out as my first role modeling example. I think, the tech industry certainly has not got it fixed or figured out. But what I think on the role modeling side, because they deeply understand the benefit of diversity, they nurture it so well that the message seeps through and through from the very top. Even if you look at their mission statement, the company mission statement, you can see how diversity really informs that statement. And separately, if you look at their diversity statement as well, they pull from their mission statement into their diversity statement. So in terms of role modeling, you start looking at what does a company say about itself around diversity and inclusion? And those companies that see it as a proposition and live and breathe it, and therefore are great role models throughout for their own company, but also for society in general, they are the ones that have diversity also embedded in their mission statements. So that's, and there's similar examples for Salesforce are very good. If you look at their mission statement and diversity statement, and of course, Mark Benioff is a big believer. There are lots of other organizations like that, but they would be more on the technology side of things who are definitely moving things forward and have quite a lot to gain from diversity.
Well, and actually, I mean, we're mentioning some of the bigger names, but I see in smaller organizations some amazing role modeling too, where there's one director that I work with who really believes in this and says something like, well, I started this company because I wanted to have a place where it was like a great place to work. And I'm finding that maybe this is not a great place to work for everyone that works here. That's not the company I wanted to start. And I mean, this is a company with maybe 15 employees. but they hired me, they worked with me. And because one of the directors takes it so serious and is on a learning journey, and I think that's the role modeling here, that we're showing that you're on a learning journey. We don't really know how to get this, and it's something that, so we're hiring someone to work with us. So we're asking questions, we're starting to measure, we're starting to go to events to find out what is going on. We become a member of some of the membership organizations in our industry. And from that, we're learning. And the fact that he's role modeling that this is, so in that way, he's role modeling this is important. He's asking some of his employees to actually go to some of these events. And I think that's just a great way of role modeling. It's like another leader that I had on stage. They were just, and you see that a lot with leaders on stage, just role modeling that they're not sure, that they're getting it wrong sometimes. And I think that is very important too. What language to use, how to say it right, how to just say it right, what their own journey is, and sharing that is also a great way of role modeling that we just don't really know how to do this yet.
Yeah. There are some really great questions that are coming through. They are, if we had a whole day, it would be wonderful to go through all of them and address all of them. And we've addressed the role model and some of the KPIs questions as well. What I might suggest is that we move on through what we had planned to share on this session, and then if we have time in the end, and those who want to stick around, we can maybe address some of these questions. That's okay. So just getting back to a couple of the other trends that we've observed in 2019 before we start predicting what else is coming down the pike. One of the things that I read about a while ago, and then it started popping up in 2019 in different places and guises, was the concept of covering. And I don't know how many of you have heard about it, but essentially covering is this phenomenon where people leave a part of who they are behind when they come into work because they feel that that part doesn't fit in with a dominant culture at work. So it's not something that is required of them. It's not something that anyone has written down and said, you know, please, can you be less gay at work? But they feel that they cannot be themselves completely, so they cover an element of who they are. And there's a fantastic paper about it that discusses 4 different categories of how people cover. Examples include anything from straightening your hair if it's very, very curly, so you look more European or Western, to dressing differently, maybe having a different type of dress, to the way that you participate and the way you talk. So you wouldn't necessarily make a reference to a same-sex partner. You would just try to hide it somehow, or even participate in certain events. So for instance, if you were a member, if you had some sort of a mental health issue, you wouldn't personally try to participate in an event or in the network, the mental health network, because you wouldn't want to be associated with the group. And so this is the concept of covering. And the reason that this is important is because the more people cover themselves, the less they're able to offer of their own individuality and diversity. But more than that, covering actually takes up a lot of your mental energy. So if you're covering all the time, thinking about how can I protect myself, then that's taking away mental energy from your work. So it's a real issue for people. Yes, and
yeah, I love it, Rena, because I mean it's the sort of thing where I didn't really have any pictures of my children on my desk, even in an organization that prided itself in flexible working. Because no one in my team had children, and they really didn't quite understand, and I got the impression that they thought I was less committed. So I didn't even realize, I never even talked about my son at work until I went freelance and I started doing some networking with women. And I would just say, oh, I got to go, it's 4, I need to go and see my son or pick him up from school. But it was just something, yeah, covering, love it. New trend for me. Was that in 2019?
Yeah. It's 2019 that it started becoming a little bit more prominent, but it's something, there is a great paper. Angela asked me for the reading recommendation. If you Google covering, you'll find there's a paper that was a combination of a research paper out of Deloitte and New York University. That talks about this concept, and it essentially sets it all out. There hasn't been, as far as I know, there has not been an update on that. It's all very, very valid. It's a few years old, but the concept still applies, and it's based on some great research that was done out of NYU. So do take a look. If you can't find it on your own, drop us a line. I'm sure I have it, and I will be able to share it.
And Gauri is saying, excellent, I've just done sessions on psychological safety, and it's interesting as the two things are so mutually connected, interlinked. So yeah, that's great, right? Interesting.
Yeah. That's the other trend, the intersectionality. That's something that we were going to mention as well. There's obviously a lot of these issues are tied. Again, humans are humans. You can't be just one or the other or a third, you know. So we cover, and this is what I think is the great aspect of starting with gender, because if you focus on women, and as you said, Inga, women cover so many different types of diversity. You can address so many different things within it. But intersectionality, how it applies to mental health, psychological safety, all of that is all tied together. Even, you know, as things like emotional intelligence, which is at the core of inclusion. You know, we can have a conversation about that, and you will be able to draw parallels between what we're talking about here and what psychologists talk about when they talk about emotional intelligence and psychological safety.
And some positive news though from the front. Last night, my son, who is 15, you know, he's in a mixed gender school, co-ed, boys and girls. And he said, oh, Mom, yeah, the second boy has now come out as bisexual. And I thought, oh, wow, you know, I mean, at 15, I certainly didn't know the word bisexual, I think. And if I did know it, I certainly didn't know any of my peers would certainly not talk about these things. So some hope there about uncovering in the UK, in schools here in Surrey anyway.
It'd be great to hear also if you have examples of teenagers or children and how they experience the world already very differently from ours. If you have any examples to share with us, please do. That'd be very interesting. Yeah.
And I've got one last trend for 2019, which is a very obvious one. It's of course the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap legislation in the UK came in 2 years ago. Then it was all about how do we communicate this? How do we measure it? What does it even mean? Then the reports coming out last year were all about, and what are we going to do? And how are we going to have some impact? And how are we going to work across industry? So what actually works, and sharing what works. And there is, I mean, talking about resources, a book, if you are looking for what works things, I can definitely recommend. It's not my book, but it's my Bible. Iris Bonet, What Works, Gender Equality by Design. And Iris has brought together all the research on unconscious bias, on how human beings behave, and looked at what do we know, how we can change behavior, what is scientifically proven, what works, and what does that mean for diversity and inclusion? What kind of interactions have had measured, and I mean here scientifically measured, so impact. So we have one group that we don't do the unconscious bias training with, and one we do it with, and then we see if actually they're starting to hire differently. Not much of that research is available, but the things that are available, she's brought together, and it's just so, I think most people that I know that work in diversity and inclusion have read it and are implementing it. The organizations that are ahead, including, interestingly, the Government Equality Office, in their guidance mentions actually the 5 key things that she recommends as the top things that have impact. So definitely a must read if you're in this area.
In the pay gap area, yes, exactly. And then the other book I would recommend generally for the business case for diversity is called The Diversity Dividend. I don't have it handy, I'm afraid to show you, but again, if you go into Amazon and Google on Amazon Diversity Dividend, you will come up with it, and that has some great case studies as well where diversity has been implemented. to facilitate success. And while we're speaking about that, also on HBR, Harvard Business Review, there's an excellent write-up about IBM when it started its diversity journey in the 1990s. We can hear you typing, by the way.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I shouldn't type. Yeah, my keyboard is too noisy.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Exactly. So it's called Using Diversity as a Strategy for Success, or something like that. But again, if you put keywords, IBM, diversity strategy, you will find that paper there. And it's an excellent example of how an organization, a vast global company, has gone through this change and the reasons they did it. So it's very, very useful, very, very helpful.
And Adam's saying there that he finds that a lot of younger peers just weren't aware of the impacts of the Section 28 legislation and just assume that same-sex civil partnerships or marriage have always been allowed. Love that. Yeah. Especially I had the same when I lived in India. People were really surprised that women's right, that women didn't all, in the West, it's all different. Women have always had these rights. And I thought, oh gosh, yeah, no, I mean, it's only recently that we've had those rights here. I mean, 1960s, right? I mean, that's very recent for, like, think for women to be able to open their own bank account.
I love that reference, Adam. I think it reminds me of when my son was little. He said to me one time, say, Mom, did you know Harry Potter is also a book?
Brilliant.
Which I thought was excellent. You know, it's like,
yeah.
I don't need to read anymore. But anyway, yeah, it's a great, great point.
So looking ahead then at 2020, what are we expecting in 2020?
Yeah.
I mean, shall I start, Rena?
Go ahead, start.
Yeah? Well, I mean, obviously, I think legislation is a really obvious one. And a couple of countries have had new legislation come in. Here in the UK, the gender pay gap legislation. Switzerland has moved to have new legislation on quota. The Netherlands has had not quota, but setting targets and being more open about certain categories. There are other countries. Let us know if you know of any legislation or countries really starting to push this, because we may be missing some. Where else have there been legislative changes in 2020? There's been talk in the UK about the race pay gap, but actually that has, I think, from what I'm hearing, that has moved down on the agenda of the Boris Johnson government. So that may be pushed back a bit.
Yeah, and on legislation in the UK, my understanding is that there isn't anything on the horizon that will officially and specifically address diversity and inclusion. So we don't need to worry yet about targets and quotas, but legislation that is incorporated into companies, the Companies Act and other ways of regulating behavior in organizations definitely has nuances of more inclusion than diversity, but also for that purpose. So they're attacking it, they're addressing it from a different perspective, which I think possibly is the better way to do it. But that's
what else do you see for 2020 then, Rena?
Yeah, so the other thing that I think is going to happen more is as companies are going to start realizing how much money they've been spending on initiatives that have made zero difference to diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
And really, you know, from that perspective, if you're just starting out, you're almost ahead of the curve, because you now know not to spend all that money and all those resources on things that don't work, and start looking at initiatives that do work. So that's starting with the pay gap report, the book that you recommended, but also there's a realization that is evolving that, as I said earlier, diversity and inclusion is something that needs to penetrate through every possible decision, communication, and department of an organization. So it's not something that you project manage as part of you know, a network or an awards event, or a celebration of International Women's Day or International Men's Day. Indeed, it really is about how do you have all the right policies on the book? What is the language that you use in them? What are you encouraging? Does your company talk in a language that appeals only to the future generation? Have you forgot or you left behind everybody that perhaps is 50 and a little bit older? So all these initiatives, everything that you do nowadays is going to also people are starting to think about, how does that resonate on a diversity and inclusion with a very conscious approach to it. So that's going to happen more and more, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And sort of following on from the whole mental health thing that has moved up the agenda, I think following driven by employees having a bigger say and gaining more power, because there is such a lack of talent. We also see other topics really move to the top of the agenda. And for 2020, I suddenly hear a lot about disability. Disability is one of the biggest taboos, people are telling me. We don't even know how to talk about it. Are you allowed to say disability? Do we call it something else? People that are differently abled? How do you even start that conversation? And some organizations have started to tackle this, and I think more will in 2020.
Yeah.
Another topic there is neurodiversity, also a topic that I've started to hear about in 2019, but I think in 2020 that will really gain traction. It's a lot about, and there's obviously a lot of different neurodiversities. It's about ADHD, ADD, Asperger, autism. There's a whole range of needs for different types of dyslexia, for different types of neurodiversity, and to provide for those and make work more accessible so that everyone can contribute. Also, neurodiverse people or people with mental health issues is something that I'll expect we'll see a lot more of.
Yeah, that's right. The other trend I think is around, and you touched on this as well, is the language, the use of language, understanding what language is appropriate and what is not, what kind of language will make a person feel excluded versus included, and understanding how to craft it. So not just in written communications, but also how you talk to each other. I mean, just the other day I was sitting next to a few young women in a restaurant, and one of them said to the other, where are you from? And the girl said, well, I'm from London. And she says, no, I mean, really, where are you from? And it's that kind of communication that makes the other person feel immediately, oh, you think of me as different. You don't think of me as somebody who's part of your tribe or whatever it is. So that kind of communication, even starting to think about the way you ask the question, whether you ask the question, is there any other way you can find out that information without making the other person feel like they're not part of the in-group.
So we need to hear from you here as well, right? I mean, you've been quite silent on the chat after we said there were a bit too many questions, but I mean, now where it comes to 2020, we want to hear what is on the top of your agenda in 2020. As much as just type one word. I mean, what is going to be, whether it is data, whether it is measurement, whether it is, age, what is on the top of your agenda in 2020? And while you're maybe it's making a strategy, maybe you're just starting out with a network, doesn't matter, what is going to be prominent for you? What is the thing you want to achieve in 2020? And meanwhile, Rina, you can go on with another trend that we see while people are typing.
Yes, so the other trend is really getting a little bit more understanding of how to tackle this whole complex issue of diversity and inclusion. How do you make it stick? What is it that's going to make, shift the dial? And one of the things that people have been started to talk about, and I do quite a bit with my clients, is looking at specific inclusive behaviors. What are they? How can we divide inclusion into specific behaviors, look at them very, very specifically, understanding what it takes, how we behave now, and how we can improve on that particular element. So, an example might be listening. So some people might say, oh, I'm a pretty good listener, actually, but find out that really we're not as good a listener as we think we are, because I do one of two things. One could be is while the other person is talking, I might be thinking about what I'm going to cook for dinner later on. Or when they're talking, I feel, oh, yes, I want to contribute with my own thoughts and opinions on this because I have so much to contribute to what you were just saying, rather than giving the person the time to say what they're saying, trying to understand where they're coming from, trying to understand what they're saying, and communicate that way. So that is an example of where an inclusive behavior like listening can be honed and will continue to be honed. And that's something that companies are very interested in understanding better.
And we've got some answers coming in on what is happening for others, but we can do with some more. It'd be so good to, even if you're just getting into the topic, you know, just say, I'm getting into the topic. I'm finding out what is on the top of the agenda for my organization in 2020. Or what maybe the top thing for you is just to learn more about diversity and inclusion. Because that's what Adam is saying. He says the top of my agenda right now is to create buy-in from other employees in working on D&I. So making sure that for others, it's getting more to the top of their agenda. And Gauri saying it's about belongingness, beautiful word, belongingness, creating more belonging, which we have talked about, resilience. Oh, Gauri, you have to say more about that. What about resilience? Resilience to people using the wrong words, using the wrong language, resilience, mental health resilience. Yeah, probably that's what he means. Genuine leadership, inclusive behaviors, very much so. We see that too. Great to hear.
Yes, and I'm
saying, yeah, go on, yeah.
No, I was just going to continue on the commentary here, and I think absolutely, John. Anybody who says we've cracked this is making it up as they go along. No one has cracked this. Cracking it meaning, you know, understanding and changing our behavior overnight, it just doesn't happen. And we are obviously talking about a journey here.
Yeah, Julie's setting new objectives. I think we've met a lot of those people last week when we ran a session on strategy. People setting new objectives or setting objectives for the first time. Intersectionality, neurodiversity. Yeah, you're not the only one, Julie. And preparing for the ethnicity pay gap, so that, yeah, you've got to be prepared if it does come in, and improving the gender pay gap.
Yes, and Sarah, you say number one for you is respect. I'd love to hear more about that, what you're planning to do about it or with it or around it. That would be very, very good. I think the other trend that is probably already here and we're going to see more of is how diversity is included in the public domain. So if you've been traveling on TfL, on Transport for London, over the last year or more, you will have noticed a huge shift in the way that they market themselves. And they are a big proponent of diversity and inclusion. I've worked with them as well. And they do a lot internally in the organization, but of course also you can see it from the outside. You can see it on their posters, on their messaging. Everything is rebranded and everything has diversity in the spotlight. That's true a lot for almost all the new shows on TV. The film, you get a lot of, you know, you can't sit through a ceremony on TV like the Oscars or Emmys or Grammys or whatever it is, the BAFTAs, without the mention of diversity, diversity in arts, diversity in sport. I mean, all of it is out there. And I think it's creating that momentum that is building and that society is starting to change. Society is almost, you know, the tail wagging the dog is actually, you know, trying to shift by making small changes. And the more we see it as a norm in society, and we will, that Doctor Who's now a woman, and, you know, all of that's coming in. Every team nowadays that you can look at, every bunch of friends is depicted as a very diverse group of people. So we see it becomes more normal, and therefore it'll become a little bit easier for all of us to start shifting in our other parts of our lives. So that is another trend that will continue to intensify, I think.
Yeah, then one last one coming in, trying to make interesting local initiatives global where appropriate, and work out focus areas for greater impact. So that's someone on the phone typing in. Yeah, definitely. And oh yeah, off topic, Adam saying something. So we won't go into that because we're getting to the end of our session. And there are some things we didn't touch on, which for instance was how to avoid otherness with data. But I want to say we have a lot of sessions coming up. So, I mean, a lot of the questions and things that have come up today are things we will address in later expert interviews, or we also have 6 training sessions throughout the year. So in September, we have an expert interview on data. So a lot of questions today on data. So do join us for that in September. And if you know a good speaker for that, let us know. We're in touch with a few people, but we could do with some ideas there as well. So if your organization happens to have got it cracked on how to gather those data, do let us know how to get people to share. Let me see, what sessions have we got coming up? Next session coming up is in February, and then I need to just check the date.
27th.
27th of February, which is the same as here in the same place, expert interview on the gender pay gap with Polly Williams from the Royal Academy of Engineering, who I kindly invited because she's worked on this report that I've worked on as well, which was just launched yesterday, closing the engineering gender pay gap, with lots of really good recommendations on what is already working in engineering and tech companies to close that gap. And some great numbers as well on the sector, but especially the recommendations on what you need to do to close the gap are very powerful. So we'll spend some time on that on February 27th. And what have you got coming up as a training session, Rena? I think that's one of yours, right?
Yes, so in March.
12th of March.
2 training sessions, the same one in a face-to-face setting, a half-day session, and then a webinar to follow, which is a condensed version of the same training. And that's looking at influencing your leaders, your senior leaders. How do you get them to see what you see and what they don't? So we'll talk about that in great detail. So there were a couple of questions on here about that. So I hope you can join us. If you can't join us in person in London, I think it's on the 12th of March. Join us on the webinar later. We will send you the recording and the links to all and everything that the D&I Big Fish Academy has to offer for you. So join as many or as few as those sessions as you can or want. And we'll also send you a short feedback. Now, we did say this is our very first one, and it would be great to hear from you what worked, what we could improve. We want to make it as practical and as useful for you as we can. So any feedback that you have for us will be very, very genuinely and seriously considered. Thanks very much. I think it was a great session. Thanks a lot for your engagement. It's been really, really great. We'll continue to, we'll look at these questions and see if there's anything that we can add afterwards as well. Right, Inga?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for those of you that have taken the courage to take part. Makes these sessions so much more fun. And we'll hope to see you on 27th of February or at one of our other sessions. Thank you so much, and also looking forward to hearing your feedback. Have a good day, and just keep going with this.
Yeah, have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye.